History is often remembered for its kings and warriors, but hidden in the shadows of power are figures who shaped entire nations in quieter, more dangerous ways. Catherine de Medici was one of those figures. She wasn't remembered for riding into battle or leading her armies with a sword. Instead, she ruled with patience, cunning, and whispers in the dark. To some, she was the mother of France. To others, she was the woman who loved power more than peace. The queen who turned her palace into a chessboard and her children into pieces she moved with cold calculation. Tonight, we step into her world, not the world of glory, but the world of subtle danger, quiet manipulations, and a reign that seemed endlessly wrapped in shadows. Catherine de Medici's story does not begin with France, nor with her sitting on a throne, but in Florence, Italy, in 1519. She was born into the famous but fading Medici family, a dynasty that once stood as the bankers of Europe, their wealth funding palaces, artists, and even popes. But by the time Catherine was born, the Medici name was more fragile than powerful. Her father, Lorenzo de Medici, Duke of Urbino, died when she was only a few weeks old. Her mother soon followed, leaving the infant Catherine an orphan. An orphaned Medici in Renaissance Italy was both a burden and a prize. A child with a name that carried influence, but with no parents to shield her from politics. In her early years, Catherine became less a child and more a bargaining chip. The Pope at the time, Leo X, was himself a Medici, and he ensured she was protected, though protection in those times was never safe for long. When Leo died, her guardianship shifted, and her fate became a matter of debate among the powerful families of Italy. To grow up in the Medici household was to grow up surrounded by grandeur and suspicion in equal measure. Palaces filled with marble floors, gardens where fountains whispered at night, and long halls painted with saints and angels. But behind those doors were whispered plots, rivalries, and men who saw Catherine not as a child, but as a means to secure alliances. Catherine's childhood was marked by instability. At one point, during a Republican uprising in Florence, she was captured and threatened by enemies of the Medici. They placed her in a convent, locking her behind heavy stone walls, where she learned quickly that survival meant patience and silence. Those long, quiet days in convent walls shaped her. While other children might have played, Catherine observed, she watched nuns move through rituals with calm, measured steps. She listened to the bells toll each hour, reminding her how time could both protect and imprison. She learned to hide her emotions, to wait, and to never show her true thoughts until it was safe. These lessons became the foundation of her character, a queen forged not in celebration, but in restraint. Her marriage was arranged when she was still a teenager. In 1533, at the age of 14, Catherine was married to Henry, the son of King Francis I of France. This union was not born out of love, but politics. France wanted closer ties to the papacy, and Catherine, with her Medici bloodline, was a perfect bridge. The French court, however, was less welcoming. To many nobles, Catherine was a foreigner, a merchant's daughter from Italy, and most insulting of all, a girl who brought no vast fortune with her. The glittering French ladies of court, dressed in silks and jewels, whispered behind fans about the plain, dark-eyed Italian bride who had arrived in their midst. Catherine, once again, learned to stay quiet, to watch, and to bide her time. Her husband, Henry, was not interested in her. His heart and devotion were already given to another woman, Diane de Poitiers, a noblewoman nearly 20 years his senior. Diane wasn't just Henry's lover. She was his confidant, his advisor, the one he listened to in matters of politics and war. Catherine was forced to stand in the shadows, publicly humiliated, as her husband paraded his mistress in front of the court. Imagine the quiet patience this must have required. Dinners where Diane sat closer to Henry than Catherine did. Ceremonies where the king's eyes sought his mistress before his queen. For most, this might have bred open resentment or despair. For Catherine, it became another lesson. Never fight openly when you can wait for time to turn events in your favor. The early years of her marriage were also shadowed by fear of infertility. For 10 long years, Catherine bore no children, and in the dangerous world of royal politics, a queen who could not produce heirs was in peril. Whispers spread that Henry might seek to annul the marriage. Foreign diplomats speculated about who might replace her. Catherine tried everything, from strange herbs recommended by physicians to desperate superstitions whispered by servants, to conceive. At one point, she was even advised to drink animal concoctions and sleep in unusual positions to encourage fertility. For 10 years, she faced the quiet humiliation of failure. And then suddenly, the tide shifted. Catherine gave birth, not to one child, but eventually to 10. She became the mother of kings and queens, her bloodline stretching across Europe, her children destined to rule France, Spain, and beyond. This turn of fortune gave her power, but not peace. Her children became her weapons and her shields. She adored them, protected them fiercely, but also used them in the political games that defined her life. Her sons would all wear the French crown at different times, yet each was fragile, sickly, or unprepared to rule. Catherine would step into the gap, guiding them, speaking for them, often manipulating events from behind the throne. In the quiet halls of the Louvre and the palaces of France, she became the shadow that shaped a kingdom. Catherine's place in the French court was never secure, even after she produced heirs. The nobles whispered about her Italian background, accusing her of bringing strange superstitions and foreign customs into the heart of France. They called her an outsider, a queen who spoke with an accent, who practiced odd habits, and who relied too heavily on her Florentine advisors. These rumors grew as Catherine developed a fascination with astrology and the occult. It was not uncommon in Renaissance courts to consult astrologers, but Catherine's reliance on them became legendary. She often turned to the famous seer Nostradamus, seeking predictions about her children and her kingdom. Some at court believed she plotted with sorcerers in hidden chambers, and though much of this was exaggeration, it added to her image as a mysterious and dangerous queen. Her strength, however, lay not in sorcery, but in her patience and intelligence. She learned how to read the court like a book, who aligned with whom, which families were rivals, and where loyalties could shift. She kept notes on nobles, tracked their alliances, and ensured she always had knowledge others did not. In many ways, Catherine turned survival into an art. She did not need to raise her voice or make grand gestures. She only needed to know when to act and when to remain still. This subtlety, this ability to weave through the currents of power without drawing too much attention, was what made her so effective. When her husband Henry finally became King of France in 1547, Catherine expected to step into her rightful role as queen. Yet once again, Diane de Poitiers overshadowed her. Henry trusted Diane completely, gifting her lands, jewels, and influence that should have belonged to the Queen. For 2 decades, Catherine endured this indignity, but she never lashed out publicly. Instead, she cultivated allies in silence. She befriended courtiers, built her own networks of loyalty, and quietly planned for the day when time would favor her. That day came suddenly in 1559. During a jousting tournament held to celebrate a royal marriage, King Henry took part in the games. In a tragic accident, his opponent's lance shattered, and a splinter pierced Henry's eye and brain. The injury was horrific, and despite the efforts of doctors, the king suffered in agony for days before dying. In that moment, Diane de Poitiers was banished, stripped of her influence. Catherine stepped forward at last, not as the overlooked wife, but as the Queen Mother. With her husband gone, her son Francis II ascended the throne, a fragile boy of just 15 years old. And where the boy king faltered, his mother moved swiftly to take control. The French court at this time was a battlefield without swords. Powerful noble families, especially the Guise and the Bourbon factions, vied for influence over the young king. Religious tensions also boiled across the land, with Catholics and Protestants standing at the brink of open conflict. Catherine positioned herself carefully, refusing to lean too heavily on either side, instead trying to balance both. She became the mediator, the careful hand attempting to hold a fracturing kingdom together. Some saw her as wise, others as manipulative, but none could deny her growing power. Her son Francis II did not live long. He died at just 16, leaving the crown to his younger brother, Charles IX, who was only 10 years old. Once again, Catherine stepped into the void, this time more boldly. She declared herself regent, ruling in her son's name. The woman who had once been dismissed as a foreigner now stood as the de facto ruler of France. She sat at the center of power, issuing orders, crafting policies, and trying to keep the kingdom from tearing itself apart. It was during Charles's reign that Catherine's reputation as the Poison Queen began to take shape. The French wars of religion erupted, plunging the country into chaos. Catholics and Protestants slaughtered each other in the streets. Towns were burned, and families destroyed. Catherine, desperate to maintain control, was accused of using every tool at her disposal: spies, plots, and yes, even poison. While much of this was exaggerated by her enemies, there is no doubt that Catherine used secret methods to eliminate threats. She had an entire network of informants and was rumored to carry a collection of poisoned rings and perfumes, though historians debate how true these tales really were. What mattered was not whether the stories were real, but that people believed them. Catherine became a figure of dread, a queen whose very presence suggested danger. Still, Catherine saw herself not as a villain, but as a protector of her children and her dynasty. She wanted peace, yet she wanted power more. To her, the two were inseparable. A weak France would destroy her sons. A weak queen would lose control of the throne. So she played her games of politics, forging marriages, making treaties, and breaking them when necessary. Every step was calculated, every word weighed, every silence intentional. By the time Catherine had navigated through these storms, she had become more than a queen mother. She was the most influential woman in France, feared, respected, and often hated. And yet, when she walked through the grand halls of the Louvre, dressed in black gowns that marked her widowhood, she moved silently, almost ghost-like. Courtiers bowed as she passed, but many avoided her eyes, as if they feared she could see through them. Perhaps, in a way, she could. As Catherine settled into her role as regent, she found herself surrounded by enemies on all sides. France was bleeding from religious conflict. Noble families schemed endlessly, and foreign powers watched eagerly for weakness. To survive in this world, Catherine relied on strategies that seemed almost invisible, listening more than speaking, observing rather than rushing, and using patience as her weapon. Unlike kings who rode into battle, Catherine's battlefield was the council chamber, the ambassador's hall, and the corridors where whispers carried more weight than swords. Her children were her greatest vulnerability, yet also her greatest strength. Francis II's death had already shaken her, but with Charles IX on the throne, she threw all her efforts into molding him into a king. Unfortunately, Charles was timid, indecisive, and prone to illness. Catherine often stood behind him during council meetings, whispering advice, sometimes even answering for him when he faltered. She controlled access to him, deciding which advisers could speak and which would be kept away. To many nobles, it became clear that France was not ruled by a boy king, but by his mother. Catherine understood that appearances mattered as much as actions. She orchestrated elaborate court spectacles, processions, banquets, and festivals that dazzled the people and reminded them of the monarchy's grandeur. These were not mere entertainments, they were political theater. A dazzling feast in the palace gardens was a message of stability. A glittering masquerade ball was a display of royal control. Every candle lit in those long banquet halls, every musician playing softly in the corners, every gown shimmering with jewels was carefully planned to make the monarchy seem untouchable. Catherine turned art and celebration into instruments of power. Yet behind the pageantry, the reality was far darker. The wars of religion escalated, culminating in the infamous St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572, when thousands of Protestants were slaughtered in Paris and across France. Catherine's role in the massacre remains one of history's most debated mysteries. Some argue she orchestrated the killings, driven by fear that Protestant leaders would threaten her son's throne. Others believe events spiraled beyond her control, that she intended a small strike, but unleashed a flood of bloodshed she could not contain. Regardless of the truth, her reputation as a ruthless, calculating queen became cemented. To her enemies, she was no longer simply a manipulator, she was a monster. To her supporters, she remained a necessary force in a kingdom tearing itself apart. As the years dragged on, Catherine watched her children take the throne one by one, only to falter. Charles IX died young, leaving his brother Henry III to rule. Once again, Catherine stood behind the throne, guiding, advising, and intervening when necessary. Henry III was erratic, often indulgent in personal pleasures while neglecting the kingdom's problems. Catherine became his anchor, traveling across France in her later years to negotiate with rebels, calm angry mobs, and plead with nobles to remain loyal. Even in her 60s, she rode for miles on horseback, determined to keep the monarchy intact. Her persistence was remarkable. Most queens of her era, after losing a husband, faded quietly into the background. Catherine refused. She endured scandal after scandal, loss after loss, yet always returned to the political stage. She buried children, mourned kings, endured slander, and still pressed forward, because to her, the dynasty mattered above all. Peace was valuable, yes, but only if it meant her family retained power. And so she bargained, compromised, manipulated, and when necessary, crushed her enemies. By the time she neared the end of her life in 1589, Catherine had outlived 3 of her sons who had worn the French crown. She was weary, her health failing, yet even then she remained consumed by politics. On her deathbed, she worried less about her soul and more about whether her last surviving son, Henry III, could keep the throne. Her final years were marked by endless effort, as though she could not stop moving pieces on the chessboard, even as her strength gave way. And so, Catherine de Medici passed into history not as a gentle queen or a beloved mother, but as a figure cloaked in suspicion and fear. To some, she was the savior of France, a woman who kept the monarchy alive during its most fragile century. To others, she was the poison queen, a schemer who cared nothing for peace, only for control. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. Catherine loved power more than peace, but she believed, perhaps sincerely, that without power, peace could never last. Catherine de Medici's world was not just shaped by politics and warfare. It was also defined by atmosphere, rituals, and the slow rhythm of courtly life. To understand her reign, we must first picture the French court as it existed in the 16th century. The royal palaces were grand but often cold, their stone walls echoing with footsteps and whispers. Tapestries hung heavy on the walls to keep out drafts, their intricate patterns showing scenes of hunts, battles, or biblical stories. The smell of smoke from countless fireplaces lingered in the air, mixing with perfumes, incense, and the faint metallic tang of candle wax. These palaces were not just homes, but stages, where every glance, every bow, and every conversation became part of a performance. Catherine knew this better than anyone. She had been shaped by Florence, a city of merchants and intrigue, where appearances mattered as much as wealth. In France, she carried that same lesson forward, using the court itself as a tool of power. Catherine believed in the importance of ceremony and spectacle. She organized magnificent pageants filled with allegories and symbolic displays that left courtiers in awe. Dancers dressed as gods descended from mechanical clouds, fountains sprayed wine instead of water, and feasts stretched late into the night. These events were not mere entertainments. They were deliberate reminders that the monarchy was not simply a family. It was a force, blessed by heaven, surrounded by splendor, untouchable in its magnificence. Behind the dazzling surface, however, Catherine worked tirelessly to manage tensions. France was caught in a storm of religious division, and the monarchy sat at the center of the storm. The rise of Protestantism threatened the Catholic majority, and violent clashes erupted across the country. Towns were burned, churches defiled, and entire families massacred in cycles of revenge. Catherine's approach to this chaos was not that of a fanatic. She was pragmatic, willing to negotiate, willing to allow limited freedoms to one side if it prevented total collapse. She hosted religious debates at court, urging Catholic and Protestant leaders to find common ground. She arranged royal marriages as strategies to unite rival factions. Every choice she made was aimed at preserving the fragile crown her children wore. But pragmatism is often misunderstood as weakness or treachery. To Catholics, Catherine seemed too tolerant of heresy. To Protestants, she seemed too quick to favor the old faith. She walked a narrow line, trying to balance forces that refused to be balanced. In the end, she satisfied no one, and her reputation grew darker. Stories spread that she manipulated one side against the other, that she plotted massacres, that she used astrologers and poisoners to secure her will. Some of these tales were wild exaggerations, born from fear and gossip. Others contained fragments of truth, twisted into legends that outlived her. Catherine's fascination with astrology played an important role in these rumors. She consulted astrologers not only for predictions about wars and alliances, but also for personal matters, births, deaths, and even the timing of journeys. She built an observatory at the Hôtel de Soissons in Paris, where she could study the stars with her advisors. To the skeptical nobles of France, this reliance on the heavens looked suspicious, even dangerous. Whispers painted her as a sorceress, someone who dabbled in forbidden arts. In reality, astrology was common among rulers of the time. Kings and queens across Europe consulted the stars, seeking reassurance in uncertain times. But Catherine's enemies seized upon it, adding it to the legend of the Poison Queen, the dark widow cloaked in black who moved through palace corridors with secrets only the stars could reveal. What made Catherine truly remarkable was not magic, but endurance. Few women in history endured the losses she did while still remaining at the center of power. She buried her husband, she buried children, and yet she never abandoned her post. She aged in public, her face lined, her figure cloaked in mourning black. And yet she remained formidable. Courtiers who dismissed her as a grieving widow found themselves quickly corrected when they realized she still controlled audiences, appointments, and the flow of information to the king. She ruled not by force, but by access, deciding who could speak and who could be silenced. It is easy, in hindsight, to imagine Catherine as cold or ruthless. But in her own time, survival required such qualities. A woman who faltered would be swept aside, forgotten, or destroyed. Catherine chose instead to endure. And in enduring, she left her mark not only on France, but on the imagination of history itself. To understand Catherine's balancing act, we must look more closely at the political world around her. France in the 16th century was a patchwork of loyalties. The Catholic faction was led by the powerful Guise family, who were ambitious, militant, and determined to crush Protestant influence. On the other side stood the Bourbons, who had Protestant ties and sought greater tolerance for the new faith. In the middle was the monarchy, Catherine and her sons, desperately trying to prevent these rival factions from tearing the kingdom apart. Catherine's strategy was to play mediator, but mediation in those times meant more than sitting at a table. It required arranging marriages, balancing titles, distributing lands, and occasionally turning a blind eye to acts of violence. For Catherine, every decision was a gamble. Grant too much to the Guise family, and the Bourbons would rebel. Offer concessions to Protestants, and Catholics would accuse her of betrayal. Like a tightrope walker, she placed one careful step after another, hoping the rope would not snap beneath her. One of her most ambitious strategies was the marriage between her daughter, Margaret of Valois, and Henry of Navarre, a Protestant prince. This union was meant to symbolize reconciliation, a bridge between Catholics and Protestants that could bring peace. The wedding was celebrated in Paris in 1572 with great pageantry, feasts, and public joy. But beneath the surface, tensions simmered. Many Catholics were furious that a princess of France would marry a Protestant. Protestant leaders, meanwhile, gathered in the city to support the marriage, making Paris a powder keg waiting for a spark. That spark came only days after the wedding, when violence erupted in what became known as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. Thousands of Protestants were killed, their bodies left in the streets of Paris, their homes set ablaze. The bloodshed spread beyond the city, turning into a nationwide slaughter. Catherine's role in this catastrophe has never been fully clear. Some claimed she ordered the killings, fearing that Protestant leaders threatened the safety of her son, King Charles IX. Others believed she intended only a small strike against a few dangerous figures, but the violence spiraled beyond her control. Whatever the truth, Catherine's name became forever linked with the massacre, and her image as the Poison Queen hardened. The massacre was a turning point in Catherine's life and legacy. Until then, she had been seen as a cautious mediator, someone trying to hold peace in impossible circumstances. Afterward, she was remembered as ruthless, willing to drown her enemies in blood if it meant protecting her dynasty. Whether fair or not, the massacre became the defining moment of her regency. Even in foreign lands, pamphlets and reports painted her as a villainess, a schemer cloaked in black, who had sacrificed peace for power. But Catherine did not retreat into shame or silence after the massacre. She continued to govern, continued to negotiate, and continued to travel across France in tireless efforts to stabilize her kingdom. She held meetings with the rebellious nobles, promising concessions if they would lay down arms. She reorganized finances, tried to restore trust in the monarchy, and sought new alliances through diplomacy. Her resilience was astonishing. Even as hatred for her spread, she refused to step aside. She had endured too much to surrender now. At the heart of Catherine's persistence was her view of the monarchy. To her, the crown was not just a symbol or a title. It was the foundation of order itself. Without it, France would dissolve into endless civil war, where nobles carved out private kingdoms and common people suffered in the chaos. Protecting the monarchy meant protecting civilization. And if bloodshed was required to achieve that, Catherine saw it as necessary, even tragic, rather than cruel. Yet the weight of her choices bore heavily on her children. Charles IX, haunted by the massacre, grew increasingly unstable. He suffered nightmares, fits of guilt, and declining health. Catherine watched as her son withered under the burden of kingship, a burden she had tried so hard to shield him from. When Charles died in 1574, Catherine once again placed another son on the throne, Henry III. She had preserved the dynasty, but each victory seemed hollow, purchased at the price of sorrow. Catherine de Medici's story becomes even more intriguing when you shift your gaze from her childhood to the dangerous game she had to play as a queen consort of France. Imagine being transported into a royal court where smiles hid daggers, where every banquet could be a trap, and where power was always just one whispered rumor away from collapse. This was not a comfortable palace filled with laughter and trust. Instead, it was a theater of shadows, where every movement carried weight and every gesture could mean survival or destruction. Catherine, arriving from Italy as a young bride, had to learn this language of power swiftly, because she was not just a decorative figure placed beside the king. She was a woman whose very existence in France was questioned, judged, and tested at every turn. To understand her position, you need to see her as both an outsider and an insider, forever trying to carve out a space in a land that was suspicious of her bloodline, her upbringing, and even her intentions. Her marriage to King Henry II was not born of romance or mutual affection. It was a union forged by politics, alliances, and strategy. Yet Catherine, who had been raised in the unstable climate of Renaissance Italy, was not naive about what this arrangement meant. She knew that her survival depended not just on being a queen, but on being useful, adaptable, and, when necessary, quietly formidable. The French nobility did not welcome her with open arms. Many saw her as a foreigner, someone who carried the suspicious reputation of the Medici family, bankers, schemers, and rumored poisoners. The whispers followed her into the heart of the French court, and rather than silencing them, they seemed to grow louder each time she attempted to settle into her new life. For most women, this could have been suffocating, even paralyzing. But Catherine turned this disadvantage into her weapon. If people wanted to see her as a mysterious Italian with dangerous knowledge, then she would allow that mask to linger. She understood that perception was power, and in a court full of rivals, her aura of danger became a shield. But Catherine's life as queen was not without its private sorrows. Despite her determination to play her role, she struggled deeply in one of the most important duties expected of a queen: bearing heirs for the throne. For the first 10 years of her marriage, Catherine could not conceive, and this failure became both a personal heartbreak and a political crisis. In an age when women were judged almost entirely by their fertility, Catherine's childlessness was not a private matter. It was a scandal, a weapon used against her by rivals, and a shadow that threatened her very position beside the king. Doctors, astrologers, and even charlatans were brought in to diagnose her condition, and she endured treatments both humiliating and dangerous. Some accounts speak of strange concoctions she drank, mixtures of herbs and minerals meant to heal her body or awaken her womb. Others whisper of darker remedies, spells, potions, and even rituals borrowed from Italy's occult traditions. Whether these stories were true or born of malice, they created an image of Catherine as someone willing to explore the forbidden in her desperation. Eventually, Catherine did conceive, and once she began, the children followed one after another. In time, she gave birth to 10 children, though not all survived infancy. This shift from barrenness to fertility transformed her standing in the court, but it did not erase the earlier scars. Those years of vulnerability had taught her a lesson she would never forget: that weakness in court was an invitation for enemies to strike. She emerged from that period more cautious, more calculating, and far more determined to never again allow anyone to hold power over her fate. Even in moments of apparent triumph, she carried the memory of being mocked, doubted, and nearly cast aside. It became part of her armor, hardening her resolve to always be 2 steps ahead of those who wished her harm. Catherine's position was complicated further by the presence of her husband's mistress, the elegant and cunning Diane de Poitiers. Diane was not just a passing fancy for King Henry. She was his confidant, his advisor, and in many ways his partner in rule. For a queen like Catherine, this was a bitter reality to endure. The court openly acknowledged Diane's influence, and Catherine had to swallow the humiliation of being sidelined, while another woman held her husband's attention. But Catherine, instead of breaking, learned to bend. She tolerated Diane, observed her, and even pretended deference when necessary, because she knew that open defiance would have only weakened her own position. This patience, this ability to suppress her pride and play the long game became one of Catherine's defining qualities. She was never the loudest voice in the room, but she was often the most enduring. This quiet endurance might not sound dramatic, but it was in fact a form of brilliance. In a court obsessed with appearances, Catherine mastered the art of waiting for the right moment to act. She knew that power seized too early could backfire, and alliances formed too quickly could crumble. So she allowed others to underestimate her, to dismiss her as the overlooked Italian wife in the shadow of a glamorous mistress. And while they looked away, she was learning, studying the French court, mapping its factions, memorizing its rivalries. She turned her years of apparent weakness into years of preparation, like a chess player silently observing the board before making a decisive move. As the years unfolded, Catherine's patience began to bear fruit, though not in the way most would expect. Her husband, King Henry II, continued to lean heavily on Diane de Poitiers for counsel. But Catherine had something Diane never could possess: her children. Each child Catherine bore became not only a link to the royal bloodline, but also a potential pawn in the vast political chessboard of Europe. Every birth strengthened her legitimacy. Every baptism gave her another thread with which to weave influence, and every surviving child became proof that she was no longer the barren Italian mocked by courtiers. She now stood as the mother of heirs, a role that was unshakable in its importance. And Catherine, with her calculating mind, knew how to transform that maternal identity into political leverage. Yet motherhood in the 16th century was a double-edged sword. The very children who secured her position also became the fragile foundation upon which her future rested. Disease, famine, and political intrigue constantly threatened their lives, and Catherine understood that her survival was tied to theirs. If her sons grew into strong kings, she would reign as Queen Mother, guiding them from behind the throne. But if they faltered, her enemies would swarm like vultures, eager to strip her of influence. This awareness sharpened her instincts, teaching her to anticipate danger before it arrived, to plan for every possible misfortune. Unlike other queens who might rely on faith or luck, Catherine relied on foresight. She did not simply hope her children would live. She strategized as though their survival were a campaign to be fought, and she committed herself fully to that struggle. Still, the French court remained hostile terrain. The nobility resented Catherine's foreign roots, and the Medici name that followed her like a shadow. To them, she was not a noble Frenchwoman of pure lineage, but an ambitious Italian, perhaps even a witch, smuggled into their world through marriage. These suspicions were not just private whispers. They were spoken aloud in corridors, embedded in pamphlets, and sometimes even voiced in council. In this climate of distrust, Catherine cultivated an image that was part reality, part theater. She leaned into the rumors without ever confirming them. She would consult astrologers and invite alchemists, but always in a way that could be explained as curiosity rather than conviction. By allowing people to believe she had access to forbidden knowledge, she discouraged rivals from openly challenging her. Fear, she understood, was as useful a tool as respect. At the same time, Catherine never abandoned the cultural sensibilities of her Italian upbringing. She brought with her an appreciation for art, architecture, and spectacle. Banquets under her watch became elaborate affairs, filled with music, pageantry, and theatrical displays that impressed not only the French nobility, but also foreign ambassadors. These events were not frivolous distractions, they were calculated performances of power. Each feast was designed to project stability, wealth, and grandeur, masking the cracks that ran beneath the surface of the French monarchy. Catherine understood that in politics, appearance could often override reality. If she could convince the world that France was united, prosperous, and strong, then half the battle was already won. And yet, beneath the shimmering lights of these spectacles, Catherine lived with an ever-present tension. She was acutely aware that her security was not built on firm ground. Her husband's devotion remained fixed on Diane de Poitiers, and while Catherine tolerated this arrangement, she never forgave it. In private, she stored every slight, every humiliation, as if writing an invisible ledger of debts to be repaid in time. This quiet collection of grievances was not fueled by petty jealousy alone. It was shaped by the harsh recognition that every rival at court, whether mistress or noble, had the potential to undermine her children's future. Catherine did not seek vengeance for her own pride. She sought it as a way of clearing the path for her dynasty. Every maneuver, every suppressed emotion was part of a larger plan to secure the Medici legacy within the French crown. It is here that Catherine's character takes on a duality that both fascinates and unsettles historians. On one side, she was a mother fiercely protective of her children, willing to sacrifice personal happiness to ensure their survival. On the other, she was a political creature who could manipulate perception, wield fear, and bide her time with chilling patience. This combination of maternal devotion and ruthless calculation made her unique among European queens of her era. Others may have been remembered for beauty, charity, or fleeting influence, but Catherine carved a place in history because she understood the delicate balance between nurturing and scheming, between appearing weak and striking with precision. And so, while many at court dismissed her in those early years, Catherine was quietly preparing herself for a role far larger than anyone expected. She was not merely surviving the hostility of the French nobility. She was studying them, memorizing their weaknesses, and plotting for the future. Every whisper she heard, every slight she endured, and every alliance she observed became a piece of knowledge stored away for later use. Catherine was not waiting for chance to elevate her. She was constructing the foundations of her power, brick by brick, hidden beneath the glittering facade of the French Renaissance court. Catherine's resilience was tested most severely when tragedy struck the French throne. In 1559, her husband, King Henry II, was fatally injured during a jousting tournament, a brutal reminder that even kings were not immune to the fragility of human life. For Catherine, the loss was more than personal grief. It was a political earthquake. Suddenly, she was no longer the sidelined queen consort, overshadowed by Diane de Poitiers. She became the widow of the king and the mother of the new monarch, Francis II. But Francis was still a boy, inexperienced and weak, and the French court was a battlefield of competing factions eager to seize control. Catherine saw, perhaps for the first time, that her years of endurance and quiet observation had been a preparation for this moment. The shadows she had studied, the grudges she had memorized, and the alliances she had noted were now tools she could use to protect her son's fragile crown. The sudden death of Henry II also shifted the balance of personal power in Catherine's favor. Diane de Poitiers, once untouchable, found herself swiftly exiled from court. Catherine seized her husband's death as the opportunity to reclaim authority that had long been denied to her. She reclaimed the crown jewels that Diane had worn, stripped her of lands, and ensured that her influence was erased from the royal household. This was not merely revenge, it was the practical elimination of a dangerous rival who might have destabilized Catherine's position as Queen Mother. In doing so, Catherine signaled to the court that she was no longer a silent observer. She was stepping into the arena, and she would not hesitate to act decisively when the survival of her family demanded it. Yet Catherine's path was far from secure. France was on the verge of tearing itself apart, divided by the violent conflict between Catholics and Protestants. Religious tensions boiled over into riots, massacres, and open warfare, threatening not only the stability of the monarchy, but also the very fabric of French society. Catherine, caught in the center of this storm, faced an impossible task. As a Catholic by faith but pragmatic by necessity, she attempted to mediate between the warring factions. She sought compromise, hosted councils, and tried to position herself as a stabilizing force. But compromise in such a polarized climate was often seen as weakness, and both sides distrusted her. Protestants accused her of persecution. Catholics accused her of leniency. In truth, Catherine's loyalty was not to either faith, but to the crown itself. Her mission was to preserve her children's inheritance, and for that she was willing to bend whichever way the political winds demanded. It was during this period that Catherine's reputation as the so-called Poison Queen began to solidify. Every unexplained death at court, every sudden illness was whispered to be her doing. If a rival collapsed, people assumed Catherine's hand was behind it. If an enemy disappeared, rumors said she had ordered it. These accusations were rarely proven, but the persistence of the rumors was almost as powerful as truth itself. Catherine, rather than wasting energy denying them, allowed the myths to grow. She understood that fear could protect her in ways that armies could not. To the courtiers who plotted against her, the possibility that Catherine might be capable of poisoning their wine or arranging their demise was enough to sow hesitation. This cultivated aura of menace gave her an advantage no decree or treaty could match. And yet, beneath this cloak of rumor and fear, Catherine remained a figure of human complexity. She was not a monster, nor a saint, but a woman navigating a treacherous landscape where survival required both tenderness and cruelty. She was a mother sitting beside sickbeds, praying for her children's lives, and at the same time, a strategist willing to unleash calculated violence to secure their future. The contradictions of her character, gentle yet ruthless, maternal yet manipulative, devout yet pragmatic, make her one of the most haunting figures in European history. In Catherine de Medici, we find not a caricature of villainy, but a woman who embodied the survival instincts of an age where mercy was often fatal and cunning was the only shield. By the close of her second decade in France, Catherine had transformed completely from the uncertain young bride once mocked for her barrenness into the formidable queen mother whose presence loomed over the French throne. She had endured humiliation, outlasted rivals, and carved out a role that was uniquely her own. What made her story so remarkable was not just her ability to survive, but her ability to adapt, constantly shifting, constantly recalibrating, and always keeping her eyes fixed on the horizon of power. For Catherine, survival was not a matter of chance. It was a craft, honed through patience, sharpened by hardship, and deployed with unflinching resolve. Catherine de Medici's journey as Queen Mother placed her at the very heart of France's most turbulent decades, and it is here that her reputation as one of the most cunning figures in European history truly began to take shape. Her eldest son, Francis II, was a frail boy, easily swayed by the powerful families who crowded the throne. Most notably, the Guise family, staunch Catholics with immense influence, dominated his reign. For Catherine, this was both a blessing and a threat. On one hand, the Guises provided stability and experience, shielding her young son from immediate collapse. On the other, their control over Francis left Catherine sidelined, unable to guide her son or shape policy. She recognized immediately that her role would not be granted to her. It would have to be taken. And so, she returned once more to the strategy she knew best: patience. The French court in these years was a world drenched in paranoia. Every alliance felt temporary. Every smile could conceal a dagger, and the entire nation teetered on the brink of war. Catherine navigated this treacherous environment by cultivating relationships on both sides of the religious divide. She would speak to Protestant leaders with a tone of sympathy, acknowledging their grievances, while at the same time reassuring Catholic hardliners that her loyalty remained unshaken. This double-handed diplomacy earned her criticism from both camps, yet it also gave her a flexibility that few others possessed. While the Guise family demanded uncompromising loyalty to Catholicism, and Protestant leaders pressed for radical reforms, Catherine charted a middle path, always keeping her eye on the one prize that mattered most: the survival of the monarchy. When Francis II died suddenly in 1560, Catherine's world shifted again. His death at the age of just 16 left the throne to his younger brother, Charles IX, still a child of only 10 years. In that instant, Catherine stepped fully into the role she had been preparing for all her life: regent of France. She was no longer merely the mother of kings. She was the one ruling in their stead. This elevation, however, came with enormous risks. The kingdom was fractured, the nobility restless, and foreign powers watched eagerly for signs of weakness. Catherine understood that if she faltered, if she showed even the slightest hesitation, France could implode from within. And so she clothed herself in the armor of authority, not with shouting or brute force, but with the calm, deliberate demeanor of someone who seemed unshakable, even as the world burned around her. Her regency was immediately marked by crisis. The wars of religion, which had been simmering for years, now threatened to engulf the nation in flames. Protestant Huguenots demanded freedom of worship, while Catholic extremists sought to crush them entirely. Catherine's instinct was to avoid outright destruction by pursuing compromise, an almost impossible task in a climate of rage and bloodshed. She called religious colloquies, summoned preachers, theologians, and statesmen, and attempted to craft edicts that might ease tensions. One such effort, the Edict of Saint-Germain in 1562, granted limited tolerance to Protestants. It was a daring move, one that risked alienating powerful Catholic allies. But Catherine believed that without some measure of peace, France would tear itself apart. Her gamble, however, backfired. Instead of calming hostilities, it enraged both sides. To Catholics, it was heresy. To Protestants, it was too little, too late. Violence erupted, and within months the kingdom was drenched in blood. For Catherine, this was the agonizing reality of her reign. No decision brought stability, only further division. She was condemned as weak by some, tyrannical by others, and treacherous by nearly everyone. Yet through it all, she persisted. She traveled the kingdom with her children, presenting herself not as a distant ruler, but as a mother defending her family and her realm. She hosted councils, negotiated treaties, and sought tirelessly to maintain a balance that often seemed impossible. And while her efforts rarely brought lasting peace, they did keep the monarchy intact, buying time for her sons to grow, for alliances to shift, and for France to stumble forward through chaos. It was during this period that Catherine's interest in astrology and prophecy became particularly pronounced. She consulted seers, kept the astrologer Nostradamus close, and surrounded herself with signs and symbols of fate. To some, this was evidence of her supposed dabbling in the occult. To Catherine, it was a way of making sense of a world that seemed unpredictable and cruel. She believed, perhaps desperately, that the stars could provide guidance where politics could not. Whether these consultations offered true comfort or merely reinforced her image as a woman shrouded in mystery, they became an inseparable part of her legend. The Queen Mother was not just a politician. She was a figure cloaked in the supernatural, half feared, half revered, and entirely unforgettable. The deeper you move into Catherine's regency, the clearer it becomes that she was walking a razor's edge, forced to balance on shifting ground where every step carried the risk of collapse. One of her greatest challenges was the growing power of the Protestant Huguenots. Their influence was spreading across France, and their leaders were bold, often defiant toward the crown. At the same time, the Catholic Guise family, still dominant in court politics, demanded harsh suppression. To stand firmly with one side would have meant declaring war on the other, so Catherine tried to weave a fragile fabric of coexistence. She arranged meetings between rival factions, encouraged dialogue, and positioned herself as the one figure capable of speaking to both camps. But the truth was harsher. Her attempts at mediation often pleased no one, leaving her accused of betrayal on all sides. The fragility of this balancing act became horrifyingly clear in 1562, when the massacre of Vassy took place. Catholic forces loyal to the Duke of Guise attacked a congregation of Huguenots during worship, slaughtering men, women, and children. News of the massacre spread like wildfire, igniting open war between Catholics and Protestants. Catherine, who had hoped to avoid bloodshed through compromise, found herself trapped in a nightmare of violence she could not control. The kingdom fractured into armed camps, cities declared loyalties, and the countryside burned with vengeance. To rule during such a time required more than policy. It demanded endurance in the face of endless grief. And Catherine endured, even as rivers of blood seemed to wash away her dreams of unity. Her personal life offered little refuge from these storms. As regent, she was not only responsible for governing a divided nation, but also for guiding her young son, Charles IX, whose reign she desperately sought to secure. Charles was timid, impressionable, and haunted by the chaos around him. Catherine tried to shield him, to instill strength where she could, but she also recognized that his crown rested on shaky foundations. Every decision she made was therefore doubled in weight. It was not just about France's survival, but about her son's ability to grow into his role. In moments of weakness, she reminded herself that her children's futures were inseparable from her own. She could not afford despair. She could not indulge grief. She had to remain steady, because if she faltered, the kingdom and her dynasty would collapse together. Catherine's regency was also marked by a new kind of political theater. She became a master of royal progresses, journeys across France where she brought the monarchy directly to the people. These tours were not simple visits. They were orchestrated spectacles, filled with processions, ceremonies, and carefully staged displays of authority. Catherine understood that visibility was power. In a nation splintering apart, she needed to remind people that the crown still existed, that it still carried majesty and order. Wherever she traveled, she carried her children, presenting them as living symbols of continuity. In towns racked by fear and rebellion, the sight of the royal family offered reassurance, even if only temporarily. It was an exhausting strategy, but it worked, keeping the monarchy present in the hearts of the people when it might otherwise have faded into irrelevance. Yet for all her efforts, Catherine could never escape the whispers that surrounded her. Enemies painted her as a schemer, a poisoner, a manipulator who cared nothing for faith or justice. Satirical pamphlets depicted her as a monstrous mother, a foreign witch who corrupted France with Italian cunning. These portrayals were cruel exaggerations, but they carried enough truth to sting. Catherine did manipulate. She did calculate. She did at times embrace ruthlessness. But such was the nature of survival in a kingdom drowning in civil war. She did not seek cruelty for its own sake. She sought control in a world spiraling into chaos. To those who loved order, her strategies looked like salvation. To those who hated her, they looked like tyranny. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between, a mixture of desperation and determination that defies simple judgment. This duality, both savior and villain, protector and destroyer, is what makes Catherine's story endlessly compelling. She was a woman of contradictions, forced to reconcile maternal devotion with political brutality, faith with pragmatism, compromise with vengeance. To watch her life unfold is to see someone constantly adapting, reshaping herself to fit the demands of survival. At times, she was the peacemaker, at times the iron hand, at times the spectral figure whose presence alone evoked unease. Yet through it all, one constant remained, her refusal to let the crown slip from her family's grasp. Now, if you were a person living in the Middle Ages, the experience of reading would not be as casual as we think of it today. For us, opening a book is a quiet, personal affair, done perhaps with a cup of tea by the bedside. But for them, it was more like entering a sacred space. Reading was often performed aloud, even when alone, because the act of silently absorbing words was unfamiliar, and for some, even unsettling. The words were meant to be spoken into the air, to echo against the walls of the monastery or chamber, as if releasing their weight into the world. To sit silently with a text, eyes moving but lips still, was almost unnatural. This was not merely reading, it was an act that connected you to something larger than yourself. For many, the danger of books lay not only in their scarcity, but in the belief that the contents could shape the soul. Ideas were not neutral. They were forces, living entities that could shift belief, challenge authority, or, worse, tempt the mind away from the safe boundaries of accepted thought. Imagine the atmosphere, a dimly lit scriptorium, where monks carefully bent over their desks, quills scratching, candles flickering, shadows stretching across stone walls. Every word copied was an act of devotion, but also of risk, because copying words meant spreading them, and spreading them meant unleashing their power into the world. This was not a neutral task. It was a task guarded by fear and reverence alike. If you could picture yourself there, with only the faint sound of scratching ink and the smell of tallow candles, you might begin to sense why books carried such weight. The very act of handling them was surrounded by caution. What if the book held ideas that could lead you astray? What if it whispered secrets not meant for your eyes? It was believed that books had the potential to speak directly to the spirit, to inspire visions, or even to invite the influence of the unseen. In this way, the library was both a sanctuary and a trap, safe if approached with humility, but dangerous if entered with pride or recklessness. The danger was not always abstract. Sometimes the books themselves carried real physical risks. Parchment was prepared with animal skins, often scraped, stretched, and cured with mixtures of lime and other harsh chemicals. The inks used for writing contained lead, arsenic, or mercury, making prolonged contact hazardous. To a medieval scribe, hours upon hours spent leaning over these pages was more than exhausting. It could slowly poison the body. Their hands would stain, their lungs would take in fumes from the ink and lamps, and their backs would ache from endless bending. In this way, the pursuit of knowledge could quite literally shorten a life. Knowledge was light, but it was also a flame, burning those who came too close. And yet, despite this danger, or perhaps because of it, the allure of the library grew only stronger. Human beings have always been drawn to the forbidden, to the things that carry a hint of risk. The medieval mind was no different. To step into a library was to flirt with the edge of mystery itself. Every volume was a sealed world, every manuscript a doorway. And sometimes those doors opened onto places that no one could have anticipated. In the hush of a medieval library, knowledge did not arrive gently. It pressed down on you, heavy with centuries of thought and unseen weight. Every book, every scroll was rare, sometimes existing as the only copy in the entire known world. Imagine holding such a manuscript in your hands, the crackle of parchment, the faint smell of animal hide, the fading marks of ink carefully inscribed by someone long gone. There was a sense that you were not simply reading, you were communing with the dead, with voices preserved in delicate, fragile form. And that alone could be dangerous, for it blurred the line between the living and the departed. The fear was not unfounded. Many whispered that certain manuscripts carried curses, whether intentional or born of the darkness they contained. Marginal notes sometimes warned the reader, "Steal not this book, or may your soul be damned." Other times, strange symbols were scribbled into the corners, protective charms against spirits said to linger within the pages. For an age where belief in the supernatural was part of daily life, these words were not metaphors. To touch such a book without proper reverence was thought to invite illness, madness, or misfortune. The library then was not only a place of learning, but also a place of silent, lurking dread. There is also the simple truth that knowledge itself can be unsettling. Medieval texts did not always read as stories. They contained medical recipes, spells, theological arguments, and cryptic instructions that seemed alien even then. A person unprepared to read might stumble into passages describing diseases, poisons, or rituals. To encounter such words without guidance could feel like trespassing into forbidden ground. Imagine being a young apprentice, opening a book expecting wisdom, and instead finding passages that describe in vivid detail the symptoms of plague, or prayers that call upon saints in ways that feel disturbingly close to conjuring. Would you not close the book quickly, the words echoing in your mind long after? The guardians of these libraries knew well the risks. Access was often tightly controlled, not just because of scarcity, but because of fear of misuse. A wandering mind, allowed too much freedom, could stumble into heresy. To question the official word of the Church, even privately, was perilous. Thus, reading itself was monitored, guided, and sometimes restricted altogether. In this sense, the library was not simply a collection of books, but a controlled vault, carefully watched to ensure that curiosity did not bloom into rebellion. For the medieval soul, to think wrongly could cost you not only your reputation, but your eternity. And so, the experience of a medieval library became layered with contradictions. It was at once a refuge and a hazard, a place of comfort and of fear. Its silence was not always peaceful. It was heavy, tense, filled with the awareness that every word carried consequence. The reader walked among shelves not as we do today, carelessly, curiously, but reverently, as though treading through sacred ground, always aware that the wrong step could change everything. And yet, despite these dangers, men and women continued to enter these quiet chambers, drawn by something stronger than fear. The promise of knowledge, the hope of enlightenment, was a flame that could not be extinguished. Even as whispers of curses lingered, even as the chill of superstition brushed their shoulders, readers leaned closer to the page, compelled by the desire to know. It was a gamble, one that weighed curiosity against caution, faith against fear. Some believed that to read was to risk the soul. Others believed that to ignore these books was to live in darkness forever. Over time, this tension became part of the atmosphere itself. Imagine sitting in a high-backed wooden chair, the light of a single candle trembling across the page. Shadows deepen in the corners, stretching long fingers along the stone walls. The scribe's ink, black as night, seems to glisten as though alive. You pause, listening to the silence, unsure if you hear the faint shuffle of parchment in another room, or something less explainable. In that moment, you are reminded of the weight of centuries pressing down upon you. The book in your hand is not merely an object. It is a vessel, and you, for a time, are its keeper. When you finally close the manuscript, the sound is louder than expected. The thud echoes like a door shutting in a deserted corridor. You glance at the shelves, at the spines of countless other books, each waiting, each carrying its own secrets. A thought settles uncomfortably. Not every reader left unchanged. Some left with answers, some with nightmares, and some, perhaps, never returned at all. This is why medieval libraries were not celebrated as simple halls of learning, but regarded with awe, hesitation, and even suspicion. They were places of truth wrapped in shadows, where enlightenment carried the same weight as danger. To step inside was to accept the paradox that the search for wisdom was inseparable from the risk of fear. And that paradox is what made these ancient libraries so haunting, so unforgettable, and so dangerously alive in the imagination of those who dared to enter. To truly understand why ancient libraries were seen as so dangerous, we must step back and consider the larger picture of their time. In an age where ordinary people lived and died without ever touching a book, knowledge itself was a rare and almost mystical possession. The majority of the population could neither read nor write. Their world was spoken, sung, and remembered orally. Words lived in sermons at church, in songs at festivals, in stories told around the fire. A book, by contrast, was alien, strange, and almost supernatural. To hold one was to cross into a realm few ever entered. This sense of otherworldliness gave libraries an aura of sacredness, but also of suspicion. When people cannot access something themselves, they imagine it must contain more than it does. Rumors spread about what was hidden inside, grim spells, forbidden sciences, secrets too powerful for human minds. Whether true or not, the belief that libraries stored more than just words turned them into dangerous symbols. To the illiterate farmer outside monastery walls, the scribe hunched over his desk might as well have been a magician. He dealt not in plows or tools, but in the mysterious shapes of ink that could summon or silence truth. And with that mystery came fear. The rulers of the time understood this fear well. Knowledge was not spread freely, because knowledge was control. A king could command soldiers, but a scholar could command ideas, and ideas could outlive any dynasty. If certain texts questioned the divine right of rulers or offered alternative ways of understanding the universe, they posed as great a threat as any army. That is why libraries were often guarded as tightly as treasuries. Within those walls lay not just fragile pages, but the fragile balance of power itself. Now picture yourself wandering deeper into such a library. The shelves curve like the ribs of some vast beast, enclosing you in a hushed cocoon. The air is heavy with the scent of leather, ink, and dust. As you reach for a manuscript, you cannot help but feel the eyes of the past upon you. Someone copied these words by candlelight centuries ago. Someone risked punishment to preserve them. And now, as your fingers trace the faded letters, you realize you are touching not just parchment, but the very edge of forbidden thought. A single passage could challenge all you have been taught, all you have believed, all you have been told was safe. And therein lies the danger. Libraries were never just buildings, they were doors. Behind each door waited not only knowledge, but the possibility of doubt, the chance to see the world differently. For the medieval mind, such doubt was dangerous. Doubt was sin. Doubt was rebellion. Yet it was also irresistible. And so readers kept turning pages, even when every word felt like a step further into shadows from which there might be no return. The deeper you imagine yourself inside those vaulted rooms, the more the atmosphere begins to weigh upon you. These were not libraries as we know them today, places of bustling energy, where students chat in hushed tones or laptops hum quietly. No, the medieval library was closer to a shrine. Silence was demanded, not simply for concentration, but because the very act of being there was considered a form of devotion. To touch a manuscript was to enter into a kind of sacred contract, one that bound you to the careful handling of truths, too fragile, too rare, to be treated carelessly. It is important to remember that each book represented years of labor. A single Bible could take decades to copy by hand. Ink had to be prepared, parchment scraped and stretched, quills sharpened daily. The cost of materials alone was staggering, let alone the countless hours of human life poured into every letter. Knowing this, can you imagine the pressure upon anyone who dared open such a book? To smudge a page, to tear a fragile corner, To let wax drip from a candle, it was not merely clumsiness, it was sacrilege. The guardians of these collections knew it, the readers felt it, and the room itself seemed to breathe with that intensity. And then, beyond the physical weight, there was the spiritual one. Some manuscripts preserved texts from the ancient world, philosophies of the Greeks and Romans that did not always align with Christian teaching. To encounter these ideas in an age when the Church held absolute authority was not simply academic, it was existential. Imagine reading Aristotle on the nature of the soul, or Lucretius describing a world made of atoms, and realizing that such thoughts stood in direct contrast to what priests proclaimed from the pulpit. In the flickering candlelight, the words might blur, but the meaning would pierce through. For the medieval scholar, this was both exhilarating and terrifying. Knowledge could liberate, yes, but it could also condemn. This was why libraries were treated with caution. They were filled not only with faith-affirming texts, but also with challenges, with heresies waiting to be unearthed by unsuspecting eyes. A wrong sentence, repeated aloud, could lead to accusations of blasphemy. A wrong interpretation, shared carelessly, could end with a public trial. The library was therefore both a treasure house and a trap. To enter was to risk encountering thoughts you could never unlearn, questions you could never silence, and suspicions you could never confess without peril. The atmosphere of danger extended to the physical construction of the libraries themselves. They were often kept behind heavy doors, sometimes with chains binding the most precious books in place. The image of a chained book may feel strange to us today, but in its time it carried symbolic weight. The chain was not only to prevent theft, it was a reminder that knowledge was dangerous enough to be restrained. To unlock it was to assume responsibility for what you might unleash. Those who walked between the chained tomes did so with hearts steady but heavy, aware that every clink of iron echoed a warning. These are not toys, these are burdens. And so, sitting in that cloistered chamber, candle guttering in the still air, you might wonder, what kind of courage did it take to keep reading? The kind born not of recklessness, but of quiet desperation, the need to know, to see beyond the veil of ignorance, to risk one's peace of mind for the possibility of truth. That was the gamble and every reader made the story in a medieval Catherine de Medici, the queen and many chose power to take it more than peace, even knowing draws quietly to a close. Her life reminds us that history is never only about dates and events. It is also about fear, choices, and the shadows people leave behind. Like the dangerous libraries of her time, Catherine's court was filled with secrets, whispers, and risks that could not be avoided. If you've listened this far, thank you for allowing this calm journey into the past to carry you through the quiet hours. I hope it helped you drift into reflection, or perhaps even into rest. If you'd like more stories told in this gentle, sleepy way, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps keep these forgotten corners of history alive. And if you found this story soothing, a simple like or comment would mean a lot. For now, close your eyes, let the echoes of the past fade softly into silence, and rest well. Good night.